Welcome to Starbound. My name's the Voice Ogre, and I'll be your narrator today. Nearly 500 supporters get early access to our stories, including brand new stories of Sunspire Academy, which I happen to do, and Freyrin and Rimiki. If you'd like to unlock early access and support new episodes and future series, tap Join below to become a Starbound member. Now, let's get into today's story. Tony Russo had known they'd come for him eventually. Not the IRS, not his ex-wife's lawyer, not even the guys he owed money to from that poker game in Bensonhurst. No, he'd known it would be them. The ones with the ships and the probes and the government cover-ups his conspiracy forums had been warning about for years. What he hadn't expected was waking up strapped to what looked like his dentist chair designed by someone who'd never seen teeth. "Subject exhibits heightened stress responses," came a smooth female voice. "Elevated heart rate, perspiration, and what appears to be creative vocalization." Creative vocalization? Tony's voice cracked as he tested the restraints. "Lady, you ain't heard nothing yet. Hey, you motherfuck!" Fascinating. The source of the voice stepped into his peripheral vision. Tall, willowy, with skin the color of winter's sky and eyes like polished obsidian. She wore something that managed to look both like a lab coat and formal diplomatic wear. Every line precise and purposeful. When she moved it, it was with the kind of fluid grace that suggested she'd never stubbed her toe on a coffee table or tripped over her own feet. Tony never trusted people who were that coordinated. "I am Yulia Okena," she continued, making notes on a device that hummed softly. "Head of Human Behavioral Research for the Zalari Collective. You have been selected for an experimental study due to your species' remarkable capacity for—" "Let me stop you right there, princess." Tony's queen's accent cut through her measured tones like a rusty blade. "I don't give a rat's ass about your science project. I got a toilet backing up in Elmhurst, and Miss Robinson ain't gonna fix her own pipes. So how about you just beam me back down, and we'll call it even." Yulia blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. "You appear to be under the misconception that this is a negotiation." "Everything's a negotiation, sweetheart. You just gotta know what the other guy wants." Tony flexed against the restraints, feeling them give slightly. Cheap alien engineering, or maybe they just weren't used to dealing with someone who'd spent years wrestling with corroded pipes in cramped spaces. "And what you want is to figure out why humans are so chaotic, right? Well, here's a free sample." The restraint on his left wrist snapped. Yulia stepped back, her composure cracking for the first time. Around the room, other Zalari, pale, elongated figures in matching uniforms, turned with synchronized alarm. Their movements had that same eerie coordination, like a dance troupe that had been practicing together for decades. Tony had broken the choreography. "Security Protocol 7 Alpha," Yulia said, but her voice carried uncertainty now. "Yeah, about that." Tony freed his other hand and then went to work on the ankle restraints. Years of gym sessions, the only thing that kept him sane after the divorce, had left him stronger than his wiry frame suggested. "You see, the thing about chaos, it ain't random. It's just operating on rules that you don't understand." He lunged. Yulia was fast, but Tony had grown up in a neighborhood where being fast meant the difference between keeping your lunch money and explaining to Mom why you came home with a black eye. He caught her around the wrist, spun her between himself and the other aliens, and pressed the jagged edge of a broken restraint to her throat. "Now we negotiate," he said. The room went silent except for the soft humming of alien technology. The other Zalari stood frozen, their large eyes fixed on their leader with panic. "You are making an error in judgment," Yulia said. But Tony could feel her pulse hammering against his forearm. "Story of my life, doll. But here's the thing. I don't make the same error twice." He pressed the makeshift blade a little closer. "Tell your boys to back off, or I find out what color you bleed. Stand down, Yulia commanded. Her voice carried an authority that spoke of never being questioned, never being denied. Tony almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Good. Now, here's what's gonna happen. You are gonna give me a ride home in an escape pod or whatever. You're gonna come with me to make sure I don't accidentally hit the self-destruct button. And if any of your people try to follow us, I'm gonna introduce them to a human concept called going down with the ship. This is illogical. You cannot pilot our technology. You do not understand our navigation systems. You're right. I don't. Tony's grip tightened. But you do. So unless you want to test whether human desperation is stronger than Zalari engineering, I suggest you start cooperating. For a moment, Yulia said nothing. When she finally spoke, it was with the tone of someone discovering that the universe operated on principles she hadn't accounted for. Very well, but I should warn you, I'm not only the head researcher, I'm also... I don't give a New York rat's ass. Get me out of here! The escape pod was cramped, efficient, and absolutely nothing like the science fiction movies had led Tony to believe. No flashing lights, no dramatic whooshing sounds, just a quiet hum and the sensation of movement that felt more like an elevator than a spacecraft. Yulia's fingers danced over controls that looked like someone had crossed a piano with a calculus textbook. Course set for your planet's coordinates, she said. Estimated arrival, 6 of your hours. 6 hours? Tony settled back into the co-pilot seat, still keeping the broken restraint within easy reach. What is this thing, the cosmic subway? It is a short-range reconnaissance vessel designed for... Rhetorical question, Princess. Tony watched Earth grow larger in the viewport. A white-blue marble suspended in nothing. It looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile. You know, I used to think the worst thing that could happen to me was getting audited or kidnapped by the CIA. It's funny how perspective changes. Tony paused. Actually, the CIA would still be worse than this. Yulia looked a bit nervous. They won't just let me go, you know. I tried to tell you before, I'm not only the head researcher, I'm also the daughter of... Yeah, lady, okay, I get it. You're some bigwig's prissy little daughter. Doesn't matter to me. Once I'm back in New York, you can do whatever you want. Go back home for all I care. Yulia studied him with those unsettling dark eyes. You are not what our models predicted. Yeah? And what did your models predict? Aggression coupled with irrationality. Primitive territorialism. Fear-based decision-making. She paused. Instead, you've demonstrated tactical thinking, resource utilization, and negotiation skills. Tony laughed. A short, sharp sound. Honey, you abducted a plumber from Queens, New York. If you want irrational aggression, you should have just grabbed a Wall Street trader. Plumber? Yeah, you know, pipes, toilets, the glamorous stuff that keeps civilization from drowning in its own waste. He gestured at the pod's sleek interior. Speaking of which, please tell me this thing has a bathroom. For the first time since he'd met her, Yulia Okena looked genuinely confused. They crashed. Not catastrophically. The pod systems absorbed most of the impact, but hard enough that Tony's teeth rattled, and Yulia's perfect composure finally shattered completely. They came down in Mickey's salvage yard in Long Island, crushing a 1997 Honda Civic and scattering startled rats in all directions. Tony kicked the pod's door open and breathed in a familiar perfume of New York. Exhaust fumes, garbage, and the eternal optimism of 8 million people who had convinced themselves that this was the greatest city on Earth. Home sweet home, he said, and he meant it. Behind him, Yulia emerged more cautiously, her pale blue skin almost luminous in the afternoon sunlight. She looked around the junkyard with an expression that might have been horror or fascination. This is your habitat? This is Queen, sweetheart. It's close enough. Tony stretched, working the kinks out of his back. Well, it's been real, so try not to let the door hit you on the way back to Alpha Centauri or wherever you people come from. He started walking toward the fence, already planning his route home. Take the N train to Astoria, grab a slice at Gino's, call in sick for the rest of the week, and pretend this had all been a very weird dream. Yulia looked startled. What? Are you serious? Tony turned. Yulia stood next to the smoking pod, looking lost in a way that had nothing to do with navigation. You cannot possibly abandon me here! Watch me. I have nowhere to go. No way to contact my people. No understanding of your world. Tony studied her face, looking for the con. But all he saw was a creature far from home, scared and trying not to show it. He recognized the expression. He'd seen it in his own mirror often enough. It's not my problem, princess. He made it 3 steps before his conscience, the traitorous bastard, kicked in. Ah, hell. He turned back. You really can't get home on your own? The pod's communication array was damaged in the landing. I would need significant resources to repair it, and I lack understanding of your economic systems, your social structures. Curiosity rivaled uncertainty on her features. Though this is a wonderful opportunity to study. All right, Jesus. Tony rubbed his forehead. Look, I ain't running a charity here, but I suppose that I could show you around for a day or two, so, just until you figure out your next move. Yulia's relief was almost palpable. I would be grateful. Yeah, well, don't get all weepy on me. And don't expect me to hold your hand. The city will eat you alive if you're not careful. As they walked toward the salvage yard's entrance, Tony caught Yulia staring at everything with wide, fascinated eyes. The graffiti on the fence, the pigeons fighting over a discarded hot dog, the distant rumble of the elevated train. Welcome to Earth, he said. Try not to die. The first thing Yulia learned about the city breed of humans was that they ran on caffeine and malice for overcrowded subways, long lines, and parking tickets. You ingest this voluntarily? She said, staring at the cup of bodega coffee Tony had pressed into her hands. Steam rose from the liquid like incense from a particularly profane altar. Daily, sometimes hourly. Tony took a long sip of his own coffee, which was black enough to bend light. It's fuel for the soul. Your species deliberately consumes a mild stimulant to compensate for inadequate sleep cycles? Welcome to the grind, baby. They were sitting on a beach in Astoria Park, watching joggers circle the track with the grim determination of hamsters who'd achieved sentience but not wisdom. Yulia had been on Earth for 3 days now, and Tony was beginning to suspect that the universe had a sense of humor after all. Explain to me again why that human is carrying the small canine in a wheeled conveyance, Yulia said, pointing at a woman pushing a stroller that contained not a baby, but a Pomeranian wearing a pink sweater. It's because people are weird. But surely there must be a logical... Nope, just weird. Tony finishes his coffee and crumpled the cup. Look, princess. You keep trying to find the system behind everything. Sometimes there ain't no system. Sometimes people just do stuff because it makes them happy. Or because they're crazy. Or because the day ends in Y. Tony gestured to the woman pushing her Pomeranian in a stroller. Does that make sense? No. The dog walks just fine. But does it make the woman happy? Yeah. Maybe the dog is older and prefers a stroller to walk in. I can't say that I blame it, you know? Yulia tilted her head to the side. A quirk Tony had begun to find kind of sweet in its own way. Isn't it more convenient for the woman to walk the dog normally instead of purchasing and maneuvering a stroller? Or putting the dog down entirely? Yeah, probably. Strollers cost an arm and a leg these days, but, Tony shrugged. If it works for her and the dog, whatever, they seem pretty happy. Sometimes humans sacrifice convenience for the sake of their loved ones. Yulia looked confused. And pets are included in the definition of loved ones.
You betcha. Sometimes, pets are more important to people than their own family. I had a cousin whose house was lined with pictures of his cat.
Yulia made a note in the small device she carried. Over the past few days, she'd filled it with observations that read like an anthropologist's fever dream. Subjects will hire photographers specifically for their pets. The phrase, "How you doing?" rarely requires or expects an actual response regarding one's state of being. Public transportation operates on a complex social protocol that appears designed to minimize eye contact and human interaction. The homeless are left to roam the streets and live in tents. Your society is remarkably inefficient, she said.
Yeah, all of us would agree.
Tony watched a kid chase pigeons while his mother scrolled through her phone.
Besides, efficiency ain't everything. You've already got it all figured out, right? Perfect systems, perfect order, perfect communication. How's that working out for you?
Yulia was quiet for a long moment. Our society functions optimally, she said finally.
That ain't what I asked.
Another silence, longer this time. When Yulia spoke again, her voice was softer. I have spent my entire life within protocols. My education, my research, my social interactions, all predetermined by efficiency matrices and behavioral optimization algorithms. I never questioned it. And because I never knew that there was anything else to question. My father would have never allowed me to fail, even if I questioned it.
And now?
Now, I have witnessed a human risk personal safety to rescue a feline from a drainage system. I have observed strangers sharing food with the economically disadvantaged for no apparent gain. I have seen you people create art in temporary media on public surfaces, knowing that it will be removed or painted over. She looked at her hands. These behaviors, they serve no logical purpose.
Maybe that's the point.
I do not understand. But it all feels so free in a way. To have the option to take different paths in life. One can drop out and become a movie star, as another stays in school and becomes a world-renowned doctor.
Tony smirked. Yeah, guess which one gets paid more.
Then he stood up, brushing crumbs off his jacket.
Come on, I'll show you something.
The subway platform at rush hour was a masterclass in controlled chaos. Commuters flowed around each other in patterns that looked random but somehow worked. Like a jazz ensemble where everyone was improvising but nobody was playing out of tune.
Stay close,
Tony said as they descended into the screeching, rumbling cathedral of New York Underground.
And don't make eye contact with anyone wearing more than 3 pieces of religious jewelry. Got it?
Yulia clutched her notebook like a life preserver.
These noise levels, character building.
A train pulled in, disgorging passengers in a tide of humanity that included everything from Wall Street suits to construction workers to a guy carrying what appeared to be a tuba. Tony guided Yulia into the car, finding them space between a woman reading a romance novel and a teenager whose headphones were leaking music that sounded like robots having an argument.
Observe,
Tony said as the train lurched into motion.
You see that lady there? The one with the grocery bags? She's gonna give up her seat to that old guy by the door.
Sure enough, the woman stood up and gestured to the elderly man, who accepted with a grateful nod.
And watch, that construction worker's gonna help that mom with the stroller when we hit the stairs.
Again, Tony's prediction proved accurate. How did you know? Yulia asked.
Because that is what people do. Not all the time. Not even most of the time. But enough.
The train swayed around a curve, and Tony steadied himself against a pole that had been tagged with a dozen different pieces of graffiti. He put an arm around Yulia's shoulders to stabilize her as well. Some guy next to Yulia smirked and whistled at her.
Nice cosplay, baby. Next time you need someone to paint all that pretty skin blue, why don't you let me know?
Tony shoved the guy's shoulder.
Leave the lady alone, pal.
The guy glared at Tony.
I wasn't talking to you, bud.
Yulia looked more curious about this strange interaction than scared. Tony, what's wrong? The guy chuckled.
Yeah, Tony. What's wrong? Are you mad the lady wants to talk with the real man?
Tony glared.
How about you leave us alone before I knock more of your ugly teeth out?
Tony stared the guy down for a moment, but the man scoffed and moved on to a different part of the train. Tony resisted the urge to spit on the ground. Yulia looked confused. Wasn't he going to give up his spot for me? Tony looked at Yulia, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was in a world that, yes, had its perks, its beauty, its joy, and its community, but it also had its corruption, its danger, and its cruelty. Humans made the best of what they were given. Sometimes they weren't given much, and it turned them into peoples like that. Tony cleared his throat.
No, he wasn't gonna give up his seat for you, though. He didn't have the best intentions for you.
Tony spent the rest of the train ride uncomfortably explaining catcalling and rude soliciting behaviors to Yulia as she scribbled down notes with fascination. That evening, they ended up in Tony's apartment. A one-bedroom that was clean but lived in, with the kind of functional furniture that came from department stores and remained exactly where it had been placed on moving day. The walls were decorated with a Yankees pennant, a photo of Tony and his father from before the old man had passed, and a framed copy of his plumbing license. Yulia examined everything with the same intensity she'd brought to her alien research. This is your private habitat?
Home sweet home.
Tony opened the refrigerator and frowned at its contents.
I hope you like Chinese takeout, because that's all I got in terms of hospitality.
Chinese takeout?
It's food from a culture on the other side of the planet, adapted for American tastes, prepared by a Vietnamese family who's been in the neighborhood for 15 years and was born in the USA.
Tony grabbed a handful of takeout menus from a kitchen drawer.
See? It's inefficient as hell, but somehow it works.
They sat on the couch, sharing lo mein and General Tso's chicken while a Mets game played on the television. Yulia watched the screen with fascination. Explain the purpose of this activity, she said.
Baseball? It's a game. 9 guys try to hit a ball with a stick while the other 9 guys try and stop them.
But why?
Why does anything happen? Well, because it's fun. Because it's tradition. Because it gives people, something to argue about besides politics.
Tony gestured at the screen with his chopsticks.
It builds community. Now, as an athlete or player, it's fun to be competitive and to push yourself to the limits. And as a sports enjoyer, sometimes it's fun to get hype about something that honestly doesn't really matter. But you find yourself rooting for them anyway.
Yulia was quiet for a while, watching the game. Finally, she said, On my world, all activities serve a predetermined function. Recreation is scheduled for optimal psychological benefit. Entertainment is calibrated for educational value. Even our personal relationships are guided by compatibility algorithms.
That sounds lonely.
Efficient, Yulia corrected, but there was no conviction in her voice.
It's the same thing sometimes. But hey, what do I know? I'm divorced.
Divorced? Yulia asked.
Yeah, my wife left me. I think the flame just burned out. We met on a vacation and got swept up in the romance of it all. But in practicality, we just didn't work out. We'd scream at each other, which way the toilet paper went on the roll.
Tony considered Yulia for a moment.
So who am I to judge you about how you go about your relationships? I'm lonely regardless.
Tony noticed Yulia wasn't taking notes for once. Instead, she just watched the sports game intensely and quietly, as though she was thinking. The Mets struck out with the bases loaded, and Tony threw his hands up in mock disgust.
20 years I've been watching this team. It breaks my heart. 20 years, and I keep coming back for more.
That seems illogical.
Completely. But that's what loyalty is, right? You're not doing something stupid because it means something to you.
Tony looked at her sideways.
What about you? What do you do for fun back on planet perfection?
Yulia hesitated. I study. I conduct research. I attend cultural enhancement sessions.
That ain't what I asked.
I... She seemed to struggle with the concept. I observe celestial phenomena. Star formations, planetary alignments. It is not for research purposes. It's because they're beautiful.
Tony smiled. Now we're getting somewhere. What else?
Sometimes. I compose music. Harmonic sequences that serve very little functional purpose. The words came easier now, as if she was rediscovering them as she spoke. And I have a collection of mineral specimens from various worlds. They are aesthetically pleasing.
You collect rocks?
They are geologically significant samples that... Yulia caught herself. Yes, I collect rocks.
Huh. My old man collected baseball cards. Never worth anything, but he loved them.
Tony finished his lo mein and settled back on the couch.
You want to know what your problem is, princess?
Yulia looked a bit deflated. I have many problems, apparently.
You've been so busy being what other people expected you to be, you forgot how to be yourself.
Yulia set down her chopsticks and looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes. And what am I expected to be here?
Here? Oh, you ain't expected to be nothing. You are just a person trying to figure things out, right? Same as anybody who ever lived, ever.
Tony shrugged.
Welcome to the human condition. Population, everyone who's ever lived.
Outside, the city hummed with its eternal song of sirens and car horns and 8 million people trying to make it through another day. Inside the apartment, 2 beings from different worlds sat in comfortable silence, watching grown men play a game and eating food that made no cultural sense but tasted like home anyway. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't logical, it wasn't optimized for anything except the simple pleasure of not being alone. It was perfectly human. The message came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, crackling through Yulia's emergency communicator with the dry precision of an official Zolari channel.
Researcher Yulia Okena declared killed in action following catastrophic mission failure. No extraction protocols authorized. Human settlement designated for orbital bombardment in 72 hours. Advise all Zolari personnel to maintain safe distance from designated target zone.
Tony woke to find Yulia sitting on his couch, staring at the small device in her hands with an expression that managed to combine heartbreak and rage in equal measure.
Well,
she said without looking up.
It appears that my father has written me off as an acceptable loss.
What's that now?
Tony rubbed sleep from his eyes and stumbled toward the kitchen, muscle memory guiding him toward the coffee maker.
The Solari fleet intends to sterilize New York in approximately 70 hours. They believe that you've killed me.
The coffee mug slipped from Tony's fingers and shattered against the kitchen floor.
Come again?
Yulia finally looked at him, and Tony was struck by how different she appeared after her time on Earth. Her posture was less formal, her movements more natural. She learned to gesture when she spoke, to modulate her voice for emphasis rather than just information transfer. She had become, in small but significant ways, more human.
My people do not negotiate with what they perceive as hostile forces, she said. Your escape has been classified as an act of war.
So fix it. Call them back. Tell them it was a misunderstanding.
The communication array only receives transmissions. I cannot respond.
Yulia's voice was steady, but Tony caught the slight tremor in her hands. Tony sank into the chair across from her.
So we're screwed.
You are screwed. I am merely stranded on a planet that will shortly cease to exist.
They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the cosmic scale of their problem. Outside, the city hummed with its pre-dawn rhythms as normal. Garbage trucks rumbling through empty streets, shift workers heading home, the eternal dance of urban life that had no idea it was about to become a footnote in some alien history book.
How long do we have?
Tony asked.
68 hours, 17 minutes.
And the only way to stop this is to get you back to your people.
Even that may not be sufficient. My father is proud. Admitting error is not among his strengths.
Tony stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city he'd spent his entire life learning to navigate. Queens stretched out below him, a patchwork of neighborhoods and cultures and 8 million people who had no idea they were living on borrowed time.
The escape pod,
he said finally.
Destroyed in the crash, beyond repair.
Says who?
Yulia blinked.
Says the diagnostic readouts. Says basic engineering principles. Says
the same kind of thinking that got us into this mess.
Tony turned back to her with something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so sharp around the edges.
Princess, you've been hanging around me for a bit now. Haven't you learned anything?
I have learned that your species, and especially you, have a remarkable capacity for self-delusion.
It's close. We got a remarkable capacity for refusing to accept that something can't be done.
Tony grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair.
Come on, we got some work to do.
Mickey's salvage yard looked different in the pre-dawn darkness. Shadows turning familiar shapes into alien geometries. The escape pod sat where they'd left it, half buried in the wreckage of a Honda and looking like something had fallen from a great height, which it had. Tony played his flashlight over the craft's exterior, noting the scorch marks and stress fractures that spoke of a landing that had been more controlled catastrophe than precision maneuver.
The primary motivational systems are offline,
Yulia said, consulting her tricorder, or whatever the hell that thing was called.
The navigational array is damaged beyond repair. The communication system is completely destroyed.
Uh-huh. Tony popped open a panel of the pod's underside and peered at the alien circuitry within. It was elegant in a way that human electronics weren't. More grown than built, with flowing lines that suggested organic development rather than mechanical assembly.
What about the redundant systems?
What about them?
Every machine's got backups, Princess. Something this important, and there's gotta be secondary systems, tertiary systems, and, something that kicks in when the main stuff goes tits up.
Yulia consulted her device again.
There are auxiliary power systems, but they lack the capacity to...
Not power, communication.
Tony traced the lines of alien circuitry with his finger.
Look, I don't know jack about your technology, but I know systems. And every system worth a damn has got multiple ways to do the same job.
The emergency beacon,
Yulia said suddenly.
Now you're talking.
It is designed for short-range distress calls only. The range would be insufficient to reach the fleet.
What if we boost the signal?
With what?
Tony gestured around the salvage yard.
With all this.
For the next hour, they scavenged through Mickey's collection of automotive detritus, pulling copper wire from junked cars, speakers from discarded stereos, anything that might serve to amplify a signal that was needed to reach across the solar system. Tony worked with the focused intensity he usually reserved for particularly stubborn pipes, while Yulia provided technical guidance that sounded increasingly desperate.
This is impossible,
she said, as Tony jury-rigged a connection between the pod's beacon and a car stereo that had been sitting in the yard since the Clinton administration.
Human technology is incompatible with our systems. The frequency modulations, they're completely different. The power requirements alone.
Would you just shut up and hand me that antenna? Yulia passed him the telescoping aerial from the old radio, watching as he somehow managed to interface it with alien circuitry using nothing but electrical tape and sheer bloody-mindedness. "Even if this works," she said, "even if we can contact the fleet, my father will not believe that I am speaking freely." "So we make sure that he knows you are." "How?" Tony looked up from his work, grease streaking his face, hands covered in substances that probably violated several environmental protection laws. "We send him something that only you would know. Something personal that proves you're thinking of yourself." "I do not understand." "Family stuff, inside jokes, embarrassing childhood stories, the kind of crap that nobody tells their captors because it's too weird or too private or too human." Yulia was quiet for a long moment. "When I was young," she said finally, "I had a pet Schwalnach, a small mammalian creature, somewhat like your cats, but with 6 legs and bioluminescent fur. I called it Glimmer." "Okay, that's a start." "It died when I was 12 years old. I was devastated. I refused to eat for days. My father, in desperation, hired a geneticist to create a clone of the creature." Tony paused in his wiring. "Did it work?" "The clone was physically identical, but it lacked Glimmer's personality. Its individual quirks and behaviors, and I realized that what I loved about my pet was not its form, but its unique essence, something that could not be replicated." Yulia's voice grew softer. "I never told, my father why I refused to bond with a replacement. I simply said that I had outgrown such childish attachments." "But that wasn't true." "No. The truth was that I learned the difference between what appears to be alive and what truly lives. It is a lesson that has stayed with me ever since." Tony nodded and went back to his wiring. "That'll do it. Yeah. That's the kind of thing that'll get his attention." The sun was coming up by the time they finished their Frankenstein's monster of communication array. It looked like something a mad scientist might build if he'd been forced to shop exclusively at Radio Shack and had a serious drinking problem. Copper wires snaked between car parts and alien technology, held together with duct tape and desperation. "This cannot possibly work," Yulia said. "Probably not." Tony wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped back to admire their handiwork. "But it's gonna work anyway." "That makes absolutely no sense." "Welcome to humanity, princess. We've been doing impossible shit since we figured out how to make a fire." Tony flipped the power switch they'd rigged from a car battery and a dozen other components that had no business working together. The alien beacon hummed to life, its soft blue glow reflecting off the chrome and rust of the surrounding wreckage. "Signal strength is actually adequate," Yulia said, checking her readings with obvious disbelief. "I'm detecting carrier wave propagation consistent with long-range transmission capability." "I told you." Yulia activated the beacon and began speaking her own language, her voice taking on the formal cadences of diplomatic protocol. But then she shifted, becoming more personal, more emotional, telling her father about Glimmer and the lesson she'd learned about the difference between existence and life. When she finished, they sat in silence, waiting for a response that might never come. "How long?" Tony asked. "If the signal reaches the fleet, and if my father chooses to respond, we should hear something within 2 hours." "And if we don't?" Yulia looked at him with those dark eyes that had learned to express so much more than they had when he'd first met her. "Then you have approximately 48 hours to say goodbye to your world." The response came 93 minutes later, crackling through their improvised communication array with the authority of someone who was used to being observed across vast distances. "Yulia, if this is truly you, respond with the designation of stellar formation visible from your childhood window." Yulia smiled, the first genuine smile Tony had seen from her since the message about Earth's impending destruction. "Kif Salar," she said into the microphone.
The Weeping Sisters. 7 stars in a curved pattern that resembles a necklace of tears.
The pause stretched long enough that Tony began to wonder if their signal had failed. Then her father's voice returned, carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before.
My daughter, we feared you were lost.
I was, but I have been found.
Yulia glanced at Tony.
You must call off the bombardment. The humans are not what we believe them to be. You speak as if you've been compromised.
I have been, completely.
Yulia's voice grew stronger.
I have lived among them for 2 weeks. I have observed their culture, their social structures, their capacity for both cruelty and kindness. They were chaotic, yes, but not in the way we understood. Their chaos is not destruction. It is creativity. It is adaptation. It is the ability to find solutions where none should exist.
She gestured at their improvised communication array.
This device should not exist. By all logical principles, it is an impossibility. Human technology interfaced with our systems using nothing but scavenged materials and hope. Yet here we are, speaking across the void.
Yulia, you sound different.
I am different. I have learned what it means to be more than the sum of my functions.
She looked at Tony again, and he saw something in her expression that made his chest tight.
Father, if you destroy this world, you will not just be destroying humans, but the possibility of who we might become if we learned from them.
The silence stretched longer this time. When her father's voice returned, it carried the weight of decisions that would reshape the relationship between worlds. The bombardment has been postponed. I am sending a diplomatic shuttle to retrieve you.
No.
No?
I will come to you, but I will not come alone.
Yulia stood up, brushing dust from her clothes that had somehow begun to look less like a lab coat and more like the preferred attire of someone who had learned to navigate subway systems and fix impossible machines.
I am bringing a human representative. Someone who can speak for his people better than our computer models or behavioral matrices ever could.
Tony started to protest, but Yulia cut him off with a look.
Father, meet Tony Russo, plumber, philosopher, and the most human I have ever encountered.
This is highly irregular.
So is everything worthwhile.
Yulia smiled at Tony.
Isn't that right?
Tony looked at the impossible communication array they'd built together, at the cities spreading out beyond the salvage yard, at the alien woman who had somehow become his friend despite every logical reason why that should have been impossible.
Yeah,
he said.
I guess it is.
The shuttle that came for them was sleek and efficient. Everything the escape pod hadn't been. It docked with the same kind of precision that spoke of technology so advanced it made the impossible look routine. Tony had never been afraid of flying, but he discovered that there was a significant difference between domestic air travel and leaving the planet entirely. As Earth fell away beneath them, becoming first a continent, then a sphere, then a blue-white marble suspended in infinite darkness, he felt something in his chest that might have been wonder or terror or both.
First time?
Yulia asked.
Yeah, first time leaving the atmosphere, yeah.
Tony pressed his face to the viewport, watching the stars emerge from the black canvas of space.
Oh, I always figured that I'd die in Queens. Never imagined that I'd be having a diplomatic meeting with aliens.
Neither did I.
Yulia settled into the seat beside him.
Tony, I need you to understand what we're walking into. My father is formidable. He has led our people for 3 decades, and he did not achieve that position through sentiment or flexibility.
So he's a hard ass.
He is a man who believes that order is the highest virtue, and that chaos is the greatest threat to civilization.
Then it's a good thing that I'm bringing my A game.
Tony looked out at the approaching Zalari flagship, a structure so vast it had its own gravitational field.
Jesus Christ. That thing's bigger than Manhattan.
It houses 40,000 personnel and serves as the command center for our exploratory fleet.
And your old man runs the whole show?
Among other responsibilities, yes. The shuttle docked with the massive ship, and Tony found himself stepping into a world of gleaming corridors and purposeful activity. Every Zalari they passed moved with the same fluid efficiency he'd first observed in Yulia. But now he could see the subtle differences, the individual quirks and personality traits that their formal culture tried to suppress, but couldn't entirely eliminate.
Nervous?
Yulia asked as they approached the command center.
Terrified, Tony admitted. But I've been terrified before. Usually it works out okay.
The doors to the command center slid open with a whisper of advanced engineering, revealing a space that managed to be both vast and intimate. At its center stood a figure who was unmistakably Yulia's father, taller than her, with the same pale blue skin and dark eyes, but carrying himself with the kind of authority that suggested he'd never had to raise his voice to be obeyed.
"Daughter,"
he said, and the warmth in his voice was unmistakable despite his formal bearing.
"Father."
Yulia stepped forward, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the space between worlds.
"May I present Tony Russo, representative of the human species?"
Tony stepped forward, acutely aware that he was still wearing the clothes he'd been working in, still carrying the smell of motor oil and determination.
Your Honor, Your Excellence, look, I'm sorry. Nobody gave me the protocol handbook, so I don't,
Commander Okena, because that's what everyone called him, Tony realized, studied him with eyes that seemed to catalog everything from his posture to his breathing patterns.
"You are the human who took my daughter hostage."
I'm the human who gave your daughter a chance to see what she was studying up close.
Tony met his gaze without flinching.
And she's the one who saved my planet, so, I figure we're even.
"You speak with remarkable confidence for someone whose world hangs in the balance."
Yeah, well, confidence is about all I got right now.
Tony gestured around the command center, with its displays showing Earth hanging vulnerable in the darkness.
Look, I get it. Your people are scared of us because we're unpredictable, right? We don't follow your rules, we don't fit your models, and that makes you want to wipe us out before we become a problem.
An accurate assessment.
Okay, but here's the thing. Unpredictable doesn't mean dangerous. It means adaptable. It means that we can solve problems in ways that you have never thought of.
Tony pointed at his daughter.
Ask Yulia. Ask her what she learned in 2 weeks on Earth that 40 years of research couldn't teach her.
Commander Okena looked at his daughter, and Tony saw something pass between them that went beyond words.
"She has changed,"
the commander said finally.
"We all change,"
Tony replied.
"The question is whether we change for the better."
"And you believe contact between our species would be beneficial?"
"I think that isolation makes everybody stupider."
Tony shrugged.
You want to stay safe, stay predictable, keep doing things the same way you always have, right? It's fine. But don't call it a living.
Commander Okena was quiet for a long moment, studying displays that showed the positions of his fleet, the vulnerable blue marble of Earth, the vast possibilities of space stretching out in all directions.
"The bombardment has already been cancelled," he said finally. "We will establish a formal diplomatic protocol for future contact between our species."
Tony felt his knees go weak with relief.
Thank you. Thank you.
"Do not thank me yet. You will serve as Earth's first ambassador to our people. It is a position that carries considerable responsibility."
"I'm a plumber from Queens."
"You are a human who taught my daughter to see beauty in chaos."
Commander Okena's expression might have been a smile if his people were given to such displays.
"I suspect that makes you uniquely qualified."
Later, as they stood on the observation deck watching Earth turn slowly in the darkness, Yulia asked the question that had been hanging between them since the shuttle docked. What will you do now?
Go home, I guess. File my report to whoever handles this kind of thing. Try to convince the UN that we need to start thinking beyond our own atmosphere.
Tony leaned against the viewport, his reflection ghost-like in a reinforced transparent material.
What about you?
I have been asked to head the new Department of Human Relations. Apparently, I am the galaxy's leading expert on your species.
Congratulations.
It means that I will spend considerable time on Earth, establishing cultural exchange programs, facilitating scientific cooperation, teaching my people to appreciate the value of controlled chaos.
Tony smiled. Controlled chaos. I like that.
They stood in comfortable silence, watching their respective worlds turn in the darkness. Two different species, different cultures, different ways of understanding the universe, had somehow found common ground in the space between order and disorder.
Tony,
Yulia said finally.
Yeah?
Thank you for showing me what it means to be human. Below them, Earth continued its ancient dance around the sun. Home to 8 billion people who had no idea the world had just become part of something larger, stranger, and even more wonderful than they could have imagined. It was chaos. It was beautiful. It was perfectly human. And in the end, that had been enough. Tony was back in Queens, installing a new toilet for Mrs. Kowalski and trying to explain why he'd been unavailable for the past few weeks.
Space,
he said, tightening a connection with practiced ease.
I was in space.
Space like Manhattan or space like outer space?
Yeah, the outer kind.
Mrs. Kowalski considered this.
Was it nice?
It's different. It's real different.
Tony tested the flush mechanism, satisfied with the smooth operation.
But you know what? There's no place like home.
That's good, Tony. That's very good.
His communicator, a gift from the Zalari Diplomatic Corps, chimed softly. A message from Yulia, who was currently establishing the first human-alien cultural exchange program at Columbia University. Coffee tomorrow? I've discovered something called bagels and require expert guidance. Tony smiled back and typed,
You buying?
Obviously. I'm a diplomat now. I have an expense account.
See you at 8.
He finished the job, packed his tools, and headed home through the familiar streets of Queens. The city looked as it always had, chaotic, vibrant, completely impossible. But he knew that it was part of something bigger. Humanity had taken its first steps into a larger universe, and somehow, a paranoid plumber from Astoria had been there to hold the door open. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but then again, the best things rarely were. The subway rumbled beneath his feet, carrying 8 million people through their daily routines, unaware that their world had just become infinitely more interesting. Above them, the stars waited with patience that spanned eons, ready to welcome humanity to the greatest conversation in the history of consciousness. And, in a one-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Tony Russo cracked open a beer, turned on the Mets game, and settled in to watch another miracle disguised as a perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening. The universe, he'd learned, was full of such miracles. You just had to know where to look.